When I was a young high schooler, I was a little obsessed with ID Software's games, such as Doom and Quake, and I even made attempts to replicate some of their graphics, such as this primitive version of a raycasting engine such as Wolfenstein 3D's made in Macromedia Flash of all things. Ask your parents what that is. Also made in Flash, with what I now think might either be childhood vanity or desperate grasp for approval, neither of which I'm going to defend now, I made a quiz about myself, the answers of which I barely know myself now. Very different person now. But one of the questions was, my hero that influenced me the most in life is... And despite a list of serious contenders including Sean McAuliffe, Cliff Bleszinski, John Romero, also from ID Software, and Ron Jeremy, I must have thought that was really funny. The actual answer was John Carmack. Carmack was the man who put together the foundational technology that make up the game engines that run Wolfenstein 3D, Doom and Quake and Commander Keen even, and his use of raycasting to make a first-person shooter like Wolfenstein run well on a machine like a 386 and run at all on a 286 was something I was always fascinated with. That's right, you guessed it, it's yet another thrilling episode of a 30-something-year-old talks about 90s video games. Today's episode is about the graphics of Wolfenstein 3D. So no, I'm not here to do the classic YouTuber thing of playing an old game and laughing at it. I'm actually here to show the respect it deserves, even if I think the names of episode 4 to 6, the Nocturnal Missions, is really funny. Not to be confused with the Nocturnal E-Missions, which would have been a very different set of levels for Wolfenstein. This video is about John Carmack's game engine, which managed somehow to get a first-person shooter to run on such limited hardware at the time. There was no fancy tools or hardware or software libraries, it's all coded up by them. They couldn't just use an API to request the graphics card, draw a wall, or a sprite to be drawn at a specific point, because the graphics card was essentially just a section of memory with a chip that sent the data in that memory to the attached screen. They had to write everything about how it's drawn themselves entirely. Since his work at ID Software, Carmack has worked on rockets, virtual reality, and in the last few years, at least, has been working on artificial general intelligence, something which I don't think is likely to ever happen, but good luck, Carmack. If anyone could do it, I suppose it's him. It makes me want to write a science fiction script where in the future John Carmack's AI research actually leads to genuinely intelligent computers who naturally try to wipe out humanity for whatever reason, because they always do. And to save humanity and prevent the cyber apocalypse, a few survivors travel back in time to 2019 to prevent Carmack from ever reading a research paper on the subject, so he doesn't develop any interest in that technology. And in real life, he has Ferraris, so there has to be a car chase in it. I'm going to call my script John Carmack Must Die. Back to the actual subject. Wolfenstein 3D wasn't the first 3D first-person shooter game engine made by ID Software. Before that was a game called Catacomb 3D from 1991, which used an earlier version of the engine in Wolfenstein. Rather than using 256-color VGA graphics like Wolfenstein 3D uses, it uses 16-color EGA graphics, only around 6% of the color depth, so way less colors to play around with, but still more colors than my computer at the time could have handled. In Catacomb, there are no push walls, but you can shoot some walls to make them disappear, and some walls are doors that can be opened with keys, which just disappear when opened. And now, some of you are smugly leaning back in your chairs, laughing yourselves as you push your glasses up in your face, which reflect an off-screen light source because you think you know something I don't. You're thinking, this idiot thinks that Catacomb 3D was John Carmack's first FPS. He doesn't know about Hovertank 3D. Oh, I know about Hovertank 3D, the 3D first-person shooter released not long before Catacombs 3D, also in 1991, a first-person shooter boiled down to its most basic essences, the platonic ideal of a first-person shooter. It's a first-person 3D view in a very simple map, which is a two-dimensional grid of walls and not walls. Walls have a color, not walls are not walls. All walls are the same height with no special behaviors and all with flat colors, but with a column of black pixels between different colors of walls to make them not blend together so much. The most detail in the image comes from the sprites, as in the objects in the game, the monsters you fight, the projectiles you use to fight them, the people you rescue. The premise of Hovertank 3D is this: you are a Hovertank pilot, and there are missions to be done. Mission 1. Your first assignment is to rescue a bunch of scientists who have barricaded themselves inside of Langston Research Facility. They were working on a new, clean fuel until some big oil corporations decided to buy Langston out. Now insiders say the corporation is going to nuke them. Mission 2. The Mitchell estate is home to many of the world's most famous activists, philanthropists, and do-gooders. We've just found out that a group of extremely rich industrialists have funded a tactical strike on the estate after some of the estates irritated some of their interests. Mission 3. A group of terrorists known as the Dark Legion are holding a bunch of children hostage until their demands are met. The government has decided, with their usual compassion, to nuke the Legion along with their hostages. Get the hostages out of there. Okay, you get the idea. Elon Musk is going to nuke some civilians, so you need to go and rescue them and get out before the nukes go off. And if you take too long to leave or you're destroyed by one of the enemies, it's game over. It was 1991. The Cold War was literally just ending. Everyone lived in fear of nuclear apocalypse that never came. That's just what people were afraid of back then. We were still living in the shadow of possible nuclear annihilation. It's just that the world ending doesn't really seem like that big a tragedy anymore. So if you thought that Wolfenstein 3D was a difficult to navigate maze, this game isn't going to make you happy either. Not only does everything look the same, but the perspective is weird, and it's disorienting turning around identical corners over and over trying to figure out where you've been. And the mini-map in the corner only shows the locations of monsters and people to be rescued, and it's a bit off the actual positions, and it doesn't show walls, so it's impossible to follow. It's like a nightmare, or it's like trying to find your short girlfriend in a supermarket. But it's still very impressive technically. How does the computer draw it all onto the screen? How does it turn the 2D grid-based map into a 3D image? Well, it uses a technique called raycasting, which I'm going to attempt to explain. No pressure, but the entire video hinges on it. For every vertical column of pixels, the game builds a ray, which is just a line. So because the image is 320 pixels wide, 320 rays are cast in the direction the player is facing, in an arc from the left of the player's view to the right of it, to cover all the player can see at once. That's the player's field of view. For each one of these rays, the game engine then determines what it hits in the map by stepping through the map grid one block at a time until the block it touches is a wall. Stepping through the grid this way is a relatively fast way of finding that point. This kind of algorithm is referred to as a digital differential analyzer, or a DDA. It's very useful in computer graphics, or at least it was. I don't know anything about now, maybe it's useless now. It's relatively quick to step through a grid compared to other structures. The ray has a direction in both the X and the Y axis, and it will always take the same length of that ray to get between grid lines. It can be stepped through one of them at a time in a simple-ish loop, checking at each point along the way, has it found a wall? When it finds the point where it hits a wall, it will have the exact value for the length of the ray that was needed to get there. So how far away the wall is from the player of that column of pixels on the screen, and to draw the wall at that point, you take the height you want to display the wall at, I'm using the height of the screen, and then divide it by the distance, and then you draw a length of pixels at that height at that column on the screen. And if we do that for every single column on the screen, we get something that's not right. It is raycasting, but it's really distorted. Straight walls are curved, and when you turn around, it just looks like the image is sliding. If you walk around it, it gives somewhat an impression that it's three-dimensional. You can definitely see the walls getting larger as they get closer, and it's somewhat navigable, but it's not right. It's especially noticeable when you come right up to a straight, long wall. If you face a wall head-on, the wall is the same height, even though the parts of the wall to your left and to the right are further away from you. They still need to be drawn at the same height when you face it dead on, and you won't get that casting the rays at evenly spaced angles from the player. That makes it so no matter the angle the player is facing, things are going to stay the same distance from them, no matter how they turn. What you actually want to know is the distance in front of the player, not the real distance, but only the distance in front of the player's view. And we also want to have the rays not at evenly spaced angles, but at even steps along an imaginary screen in front of the player. This is called a projection. We are projecting the 3D world onto this flat surface because it's going to be displayed on a flat screen, or a flat-ish screen. I saw a lot of videos on raycasting. where they would correct the distance of the rays to the side using the cosine of the angle from the center and also spread out the angles of the rays that they were casting. But I didn't do that. I just sent the rays to the correct points at varying lengths so that when the raycasting algorithm returned the value in the lengths of the rays, that was actually giving me the distance in front of the player and not the total distance. So now here's a 3D scene that looks as we expect it to. And now if I find myself looking at a straight wall, it's actually straight and perspective correct, just like the walls in Hovertank. But if you drive around in Hovertank, you'll notice it's not quite like my version. The walls look about the right size and shape when you face them head on, but when they're side on, or you're looking in the distance, it looks like everything's been flattened. Hovertank looks this way because the field of view in Hovertank is very low. That flat projection used to point the rays towards is calculated to be a certain distance from the player, and if you increase that projection distance, it lowers that field of view and makes everything larger on screen. Hovertank has a much lower field of view, something like this. And so when you look down a path or in the distance, it all looks very compressed. It's not wrong, it's not an incorrect projection, it's actually the same thing modern games do when they are showing a zoomed in image, such as through binoculars or any other kind of zoom. But it does make it surprisingly hard to navigate. It feels like you're walking so much slower. Now in Hovertank, you're in a hovertank. And to show that it's a hovertank, the view moves up and down as if the hovertank is hovering up and down itself. But it's not really moving up and down, it's just sliding the image up and down to make the appearance of it. The camera itself isn't moving up and down, the walls stay the same shape, just the image drawn is shifted up or down. If it were actually moving up or down, it would look more like this, but that makes drawing the walls more complicated. A height needs to be calculated for both the top and the bottom of the walls instead of just using the same for both. And that's how all the walls in Hovertank are drawn. But there's one more aspect we're missing. The enemies, civilians and weapons. And these are drawn like a flat picture in the scene that always faces the player, and they're called sprites. Sprites are drawn by figuring out where on the screen they're gonna be and what the size they'll be and drawing an image scale to that size. So first we rotate the sprite's point location around the player so we can see how far they are in front of the player and how far to the side of the player they are. If they're behind the player, they don't need to be drawn, but for all the sprites in front of the player, work out which column of pixel the center of the sprite is, and to do that, you divide the sideways distance by the distance in front of the player. The same calculation for wall height, but now we're doing it for the position on the screen of the sprite. So if we do that, and we put a white dot where the sprite is, we get this, the position of the sprite on the screen. And now we get the size of the sprite. And the texture is a square, so the width and the height are the same, and the width and the height are the height of the sprite divided by the distance. The same calculations as for the wall height. We also need to draw closer sprites on top of more distant sprites, so we sort the sprites with the distance from the player and draw the sprites furthest to closest. But we're not done, because what happens if the sprite is behind a wall? It still shows up as if the wall isn't there, which is probably not what you want. Fortunately for every column on the screen, we already have the depth from when we cast the ray to find the wall, and we know the depth of the sprite, so we can just check for every column of the sprite and only draw the sprite on that column if it's not behind a wall, and then we get this. And now we have to decorate it with a picture. There's not much of a use to have a bunch of white squares everywhere. We need to put an image on the sprite. I'll put the ceiling lamp from Wolfenstein 3D here. First, we calculate the x coordinate of the texture from left to right and the y coordinate of the sprite from top to bottom. To calculate these coordinates, we find the leftmost column of the sprite's texture coordinate, which is going to be 0, and we find out how much it changes for each pixels. So if the sprite is far enough away to be 25 pixels tall and our texture is 64 pixels, every pixel is going to increment the horizontal texture coordinate by 2.56. So first column is 0, second column is 2.56, so rounded down to 2. The next is 5.12, rounded down to 5. You can get the texture coordinate for all 25 pixels by doing mostly additions, which can make it really fast. If we do all of that, we have a sprite with an image scaled as you'd expect it to be. But we're still quite obviously not done, because what the hell is all that magenta? And that's the part of the texture we're not supposed to draw. It's the transparent part. It's the 90s. In the 90s, textures didn't have an alpha channel. There were no transparent PNGs, at least none I'm aware of. No separate color channel for transparency. Instead, they chose a specific color that would be used to represent transparency. And this particular color is the one that Wolfenstein uses, because this is the sprite texture from Wolfenstein 3D. So, when each pixel is being drawn, if the color of the texture is the transparent color, it doesn't draw a pixel there and it goes on to the next. So for fun, I added a few of these goblins from ID's later game Catacomb 3D to fill the scene up chaotically. Look at these little guys. No, they're just little guys. But that's the basics of the graphics of Hovertank. Essentially the bare minimum needed to make a world look 3D to run on ancient computers. How the hell did that run on a 286? A 12 MHz 286. Not even the higher end 25 MHz 286s. No one had those except businesses and oil tycoons. Making all of this really made me appreciate what it would have taken. In particular, since all of this information wasn't readily available then, John Carmack was coming up with this stuff, reading papers, figuring out the best way to use trigonometry to reduce the amount of real-time calculations. It truly is amazing what he got working on his machines. But he and ID Software, which weren't ID Software at the time, wasn't finished. 7 months later, that same year, another ID Software first-person shooter was released, with the same engine, named Catacomb 3D, which has a very obvious upgrade: wall textures. And what a difference it makes. Hovertank might be fundamentally the same game engine, but with blank coloured walls, the only thing different about each level is the flavoured text just before it. But with Catacombs, now there are brick walls, and some different brick walls. How do these textures work? Well, we're already casting rays into the scene to draw the walls based on their distance. Those rays hit the wall at a certain point on the grid, and how far that point is along the grid line hit is where the X texture coordinate is. And so we get that X coordinate, and we use that X texture for the entire length of the wall drawn from top to bottom. But we calculate the Y texture coordinate for each pixel along the way based on how far along the wall we are. The same we did for the sprites. And it really makes it a lot easier to navigate and understand what's going on to have textures enabled. Just like with the sprites, the first coordinate on the texture for walls that stretch above the screen is the most difficult to calculate. And in Catacombs it mostly works, except when you get too close and the wall texturing height gets maxed out. But it only happens when it's really close to the player, so it doesn't really matter in regular gameplay sets. You probably don't want to be looking at the walls this close, so the performance or memory increase that definitely came out of it was worth it. And the reason it would look like this is to start the algorithm for texturing, it needs to have the points where the texture coordinates start and ends. And instead of doing an expensive set of calculations to find those points, they would just have a pre-calculated list of where the texture starts and ends for a set of wall sizes that are bigger than the screen. And to save memory, this list wouldn't include that many walls, none closer than this. So the closer they are to playing this, it will just bottom out. And to handle it for sprites, it simply just doesn't draw the sprites that are closer than that, it just stops drawing them. But getting this close to the walls in Catacomb 3D revealed something that went missing in the engine upgrade to Catacomb. The wall collision in Hovertank lets you slide along the walls, or at least it seems to. It's a bit hard to tell. It makes a bumping sound and you just sort of seem to slide along it. But in the wall collision in Catacomb 3D just stops you dead in your tracks and makes a very annoying sound. I couldn't find anything about that, but I wonder if that too was a performance saving choice. Or maybe the walls just have more friction since they're textured now. They aren't just textured now though, that's not the only enhancement, they also have some interactivity. Things like destructible walls, which when you shoot the wall they change into a briefly animated explosion texture and then disappear. There are also walls with a keyhole, and if you have the key for them you can open them up and walk on through. It does make for a more interesting game, better to play, definitely better to look at, and with a lot more to do. The formula for the first person shooter where you see your weapon on the bottom of the screen, in this case your hand, collecting keys, items, opening doors and finding secret areas, it's all here in its most basic form for the first time. There were sequels to this game, but those were actually not made by ID Software, they were made by Softdisk. They added back in the ability to slide along walls instead of just being stopped by it. They made some much nicer sprites and wall textures. Honestly, I love the aesthetics of Catacomb Abyss. Look at this graveyard. I can only call it 16 colored gothic. But besides the wall collision change, Nothing else about this engine seems to have changed. ID Software's own next game was the legendary game itself, Wolfenstein 3D, which came with some great enhancements, making it feel much better just to look at. The most obvious enhancement is the jump to 256 color VGA graphics. Now the color palette's much nicer to look at. The textures and sprites are more appealing, except for these hideous purple walls, which I understand is a leftover relic of Wolfenstein starting its life as an EGA 16 color game. At least we can slide along the walls again, even if they are ugly purple walls. Feels good. And the soundscape is much more impressive too, starting you out with this incredible theme song that stirs my Germanic heart with long lost pride. Actually, it's Horse Vessel Lied, the anthem for the Nazi Party, which I find poetic to place at the start of a game which is entirely about shooting Nazis, which really does have a sort of ageless appeal to it. These Nazis are much more enjoyable to fight than the monsters of Catacomb 3D or Hovertank. Not just graphically and philosophically, but the controls and each enemy not taking a dozen shots to go down like they do in Catacomb definitely helps too. More impactful weapons, enemies that react to being hit by them, and who shout out when they see you alerting all the other nearby enemies. It's so much more pleasant, even as it's still very dated. Another addition to the game engine are these doors, which aren't drawn the same way as a regular wall. They're a wall that's inside of a block in the middle, so they aren't lining up with the grid. And when they open, they slide open smoothly, instead of just suddenly disappearing in the way doors were done in Catacomb 3D. They also have a different wall texture for the wall they're next to. So the blocks next to them don't just have one wall texture for every side like the rest of the blocks, it has a special one for the door. To implement this, when the ray is cast at these doors from the player, there are three possibilities. It hits the door, it hits the wall next to the door, and it goes through where the door opened. So if the ray is cast from the player's view, enters the block with the door in it, it will first check, does it hit the door? So figure out where the ray will be when it lines up with the door itself, when its Y point matches the Y point of the door. And now we check the intersection point against the door's current position. If it is its X point greater than the start of the door and less than the end of the door. So let's first follow this ray, which doesn't hit the door and goes straight through it. So we check what position the ray is when it lines up with the door, and it misses. It hits the part where it's open because the X point is greater than the end of the door. So the ray continues casting as usual, hits the next block, an empty one, and then continues on as before until it hits something else. But if the ray hits the partially open door, we draw the distance of that door, as if it were a wall with the door's texture. We know the distance we should draw the wall because we had the length of the ray to get to that point, and we know the position we hit the wall in, so we can get the texture X coordinate by taking where we hit and adding to that texture coordinate how open the door is, as in how much the door is slid to the side. Then we can draw the door texture at that column of pixel, scaling at the same height we would if it were a wall. And if the ray doesn't hit a door and hits the wall next to it, essentially this will behave like hitting any other wall, except that we were just in a doorway. So we override the wall texture of the block with the texture of the doorway. And if you do all that, you get this. One of the great things about doing doors like this is they look impressive, at least they look 1992 impressive, but they are a solid door, so they also block the view through them. So whatever's behind a closed door doesn't need to be checked. Once it hits the door, it's done. So a closed door is faster to draw than an open one. And since they automatically close, it means that it's going to naturally limit how much can be seen, and it's going to speed up the drawing. Another special new feature that wasn't in previous games are pushable walls. Walls which, when you use the space bar on them, will slide away from you up to 2 spaces, stopping if they hit another wall. Carmack complained about adding these walls in because they would violate the sanctity of his codebase, but he was convinced to do it anyway, and it was definitely worth it. They really added something to the game. I can understand why he wouldn't want to do it, as the rest of the rendering is based on blocks that aren't moving, so it's easy to know which blocks to test. But if the blocks move around now, it's not so easy. But in tribute to how Carmack didn't want to do this because it ruined his codebase, I ruined my codebase even more than it already was by adding in this stupid moving cube. It was super difficult because my hacky code didn't have room to add this in, so my bad code is now significantly worse after making it do this. But as messy as implementing that into the game was, and as upset as Carmack might have been when he implemented it, it's definitely worth it. It really did add to the game. It let them hide a lot of things. It let them finally have some secrets in there. There was going to be a sequel to Wolfenstein 3D made by Apogee Software, which was cancelled, but the developers of incredible power at Apogee Software didn't stop and kept making it. But instead of making it a Wolfenstein game, it became Rise of the Triad. The game took everything about the Wolfenstein 3D engine and just went insane with it. They pushed it to its absolute limits, adding so much it's almost unrecognisable. The map's still a two-dimensional grid of walls and things, but the walls can be any height. They all have to be the same height for every level, as it's all still doing the raycasting where once it hits a wall it's done and goes no further. So it couldn't do some walls of one height and some walls of a different height, but it does give the maps an impression of verticality. It also has new kinds of walls. It takes the way Wolfenstein drew doors, as in a flat wall in the middle of a block, and used them for other things like breakable glass, arched doorways. It uses them to give the map some varied heights by giving the player these platforms to walk on, which might seem like a real cheap hack way of doing it, except that I implemented one small example of a transparent doorway into my version, and when I stood close to it my frame rate went straight down. So I just found myself very impressed that their version of it could do so much more of that and run so much faster. It also takes the moving walls of Wolfenstein and just puts them to crazy use, bouncing around the maps, crushing things in their way, burning them. I always thought these moving walls were super cool, and at the time there was nothing else like it. Doom couldn't have walls that moved that way, and Wolfenstein only had walls that slowly slid forward 2 spaces. These ones moved around in patterns and had to be dodged. And now that I know how drawing these is so much less simple than the rest of the walls, I can't help but be even more impressed. But what probably stands out the most initially are the floor or the ceiling. So no longer is it just a flat colour, there's a floor texture and sometimes a sky or a ceiling texture as well. In Rise of the Triad, the entire map has the same floor or ceiling. That simplifies the drawing a lot, but it's much more effective than a flat colour. It means they can have both outdoor and indoor themed maps. I did these floor textures in my version with how I assumed they were done, but then I read a little more and found out how badly I did them. One of the simplest effects that's in Rise of the Triad is the vertical look. You can now look up and down in Rise of the Triad, but it's not really looking up and down. It's actually doing the same thing as the hovering effect from Hovertank 3D. The image is being shifted up or down to show more above or below the player's view. I've seen it referred to as Y-shearing. It can't go too far before it starts to look really weird, but it is needed in Rise of the Triad so you can see enemies coming from higher up or lower down than you are. Without it, these levels couldn't be as tall as they are, as the player wouldn't be able to see or shoot people that aren't on the same level as them. This effect was also used in build engine games like Duke Nukem 3D for its vertical look, and I found an interesting tangent about that. A quote from the website of Ken Silverman, creator of the build engine which was used in Duke Nukem 3D. In his history of the engine on his own website, he has this line mentioning Rise of the Triad, dated 24th April 1994. Added fake looking up and down after discovering that it wasn't too difficult to shift the screen up and down. 3 days later, that same effect mysteriously appears in Apogee's other game that they were working on at the time, Rise of the Triad. What a coincidence! Even if they stole Ken Silverman's fake vertical look, the totality of everything else they added is really just impressive, and how much of it is on screen at the same time is super impressive. Even the maps themselves are so much larger, but that might actually be a complaint since it does make for some incredibly difficult mazes to get lost in. The developers called themselves the developers of incredible power, and they deserve to. They made all of this run on a 486, which is a much more powerful machine than the one that Wolfenstein needs to run. Sure, there would have to be to do as much as it does, but this is still quality work. And all of its graphics, as wildly different as they appear, traces back to the flat coloured walls with the 16 colour EJ graphics that Carmack got running on a 286 in 1991 in Hovertank 3D. After Wolfenstein 3D popularised this new genre, naturally, there were imitations, what we used to call clones at the time. Anything with the squared off walls was a Wolfenstein clone, and anything that was a bit more advanced was a Doom clone. My favourite of the Wolf clones is Ken's Labyrinth from 1993, a game by Ken Silverman, who had his vertical look effect stolen for Rise of the Triad. I really love his earlier work here. It's absurdist. It's a first-person shooter where the first weapon you get is a jelly. You pick it up off a hook in the first room. It's a slow-moving projectile, doesn't go very far, but I suppose you can't accuse it of having no feeling of impact when it hits an enemy, considering most of them go down with one hit. Until you meet these robots, which take a few hits.
Ouch!
But at least it makes a satisfying thunk noise when it hits them. And when you get hit, the game plays a recording of the developer Ken Silverman saying the word ouch, which is doubly fun when you take repeated damage, and he says, ouch! It does work the PC a lot harder than the ID Software games though, with all the partially see-through walls, the ability to change your view height, the increased quantity of things on the screen at one time, and particularly these spinning fans, which I remember at the time my family computer couldn't handle, and it slowed it down to a crawl to have even a couple of them on screen at once, which is great, because there's always a couple of them at least. So, sure, the combat is a bit rubbish, it feels thrown together with a bunch of programmer art, the gameplay is clumsy at best, and the enemies feel quite polite as they queue up waiting to be shot by you. But it's got the most interesting environments out of any of the orthogonal wall games, and feels like the most actual gameplay progression of any of them as you go through the levels. I mean, in episode 2 you get a dog. It also taught me that gambling is great when you win. In 1994, a company called Capstone released 2 games using the Wolfenstein engine, Corridor 7 Alien Invasion and Operation Body Count. They are, or at least feel like, the same game with a different theme. In Corridor 7 Alien Invasion, you shoot aliens in awful ugly environments. They added the distance shading and a lot of see-through walls, but all it seems to do is make the ugly game uglier and run worse, because now it takes a whole lot more processing power to run. I bought it on GOG.com because I really wanted to see it, but the default DOSBox settings from GOG were not enough to run it. It was a slideshow and I had to manually increase it. All that for a game where the turning speed is agonizingly slow, the weapons suck, it looks bad, feels bad, and for some reason, this one random area on the first map damages you even though there's nothing there, just when you're standing in it. So I guess that's the place, that's Corridor 7, the corridor that hurts you. In their other game, which I assume was made later, but I don't really know, Operation Body Count, you play as a member of a special government assault team to rescue government officials inside the headquarters of the United Nations, which have been taken hostage by foreign terrorists led by Victor Balok. And naturally, because first impressions count, it starts you in a sewer level, but not just any sewer level, this sewer level. It might just be the ugliest game I've ever played. The level of aesthetic offense given here is remarkable, and it has an awful gun with unlimited ammo, with a significantly worse gun with unlimited ammo, and the first 5 levels you fight rats, bigger rats, and this weird ineffective humanoid enemy in these unpassable environments. If I didn't have a map, I wouldn't have been able to make it through it as a kid. The goal is to climb up from the sewer into the building, which would be fine, except I got 3 levels in and I hated every minute of it. And then I read there were 2 more of these sewer levels before you get out of it, so I stopped playing. The most notable thing about this game is they tried to do floor and ceiling textures, but either they could not map those textures properly, or maybe they couldn't get it to run fast enough, which is understandable. My floor textures are the slowest part of my version. So they just sort of put them there almost entirely unmapped, making the uglier game uglier. I hadn't gotten very far and gave up because there's no real incentive for me to go further with either of these games. If my career was YouTube gamer, I would do it, because guy who gets unreasonably angry playing bad games that he doesn't actually have to play and could easily turn off is apparently still a thriving genre. But I'm a web developer, and I don't feel the need to debase myself that way. This is a dignity zone. 1994 also saw the release of Nightmare 3D, a game by developer David P. Gray, the same developer of the beloved Hugo's House of Horror adventure game. And I say beloved because I beloved those games and in fact have them on disc to this day still, and those are adventure games. And Nightmare 3D, also on this disc but only the shareware version, is a sequel to those but a first-person shooter. although I did actually have to download the shareware online as I ran into a problem loading the disc. So, Nightmare 3D. It's not great to play. Frame rate is locked to some unpleasant rate even if your machine can handle more, which makes any subtle aiming hard. You try to aim at a bat, miss, correct, overshoot, miss again. It's annoying watching your shot go right past a bat. Sometimes it feels like it goes straight through them as well. But at least it's not so hard to hit the bigger enemies like the mummies and the Frankensteins. I quite like the aesthetics though. The curtain doors, sliding bookshelves, those nice big kitchens that are everywhere, the garish colours. This is definitely not a rental. And the soundtrack and that early Universal Studios horror movie vibe, I love it for that. But playing it isn't great. It controls and feels bad, and then you stumble into a room full of skeletons which have a ranged lightning attack, and it's a struggle to even hit one. It's painful. But it's very funny waiting for a door to open, and while it's sliding open you can't shoot or move through it, but the enemies act like it's still closed. So they just stand there on the other side unable to see you, waiting patiently for it to fully open. Now I only have the shareware version on my disc, but if you want to play the full game, David Gray still sells it on his website for $6 for a digital download, or you could buy his digital puzzle game, Jigsaws Galore. This is buzz marketing for David Gray. Like, I really do like Hugo's House of Horrors. In 1995, a company called Wisdom Tree licensed the Wolfenstein 3D engine for their game Super Noah's Ark 3D, an unlicensed Super Nintendo game that needed another Super Nintendo game to bypass the security checks to get it to run. It's an interesting one because ID Software let them use the game engine out of spite because they were mad at Nintendo, except they didn't. That's actually not true, it's just a rumour that I've seen repeated but has no basis in reality. There are a few places where that rumour was counted, but the easiest one to show is this Reddit Ask Me Anything with John Romero. He's one of the programmers from ID Software. You probably know him from building the installation program for Wolfenstein 3D because it was on multiple discs. So, you know, very famous for that. In this Ask Me Anything, he was asked, is the rumour true that the Wolfenstein engine was licensed for Super Noah's Ark 3D due to unhappiness with how the Super Nintendo ports were handled? And Romero replied, no, we just thought it would be funny to use the Wolf 3D SNES engine in a religious game. And he's right, it is funny. It's not a good game, but it is funny. In it, you play as Noah, and you walk around your ark and use a slingshot to shoot food at the animals to get them to go to sleep. Based on the broken cages, it seems that all of the animals have busted out. I remember reading this in Genesis chapter 6, the classic Bible story of Noah, the guy who sucks at building cages for goats. In his defense, he had to do it on real short notice. God learned a valuable lesson that day. You can have it quick or good, but not both. Either way, it is less satisfying to feed a goat than to kill a Nazi. The weapons, which if you can call it that, the food slingshot, don't feel impactful at all. It just feels like I'm missing all the time. There's no feedback at all to it until suddenly the animal curls up and goes to sleep. But the goat attacking you by turning around and kicking you with its back legs is honestly fantastic. Also from 1995, a game called Hurl, or H-U-R-L. Another non-violent shooter with similar raycasting engine. This time, instead of a religious message about how bad Noah was at his one job, it's got a message about environmentalism. The message being if you pick up a biodegradable apple core off the ground, you'll get 25 cents and you can buy water balloons with it from a vending machine and then throw those water balloons at animals, leaving broken rubber balloon bits everywhere, which is good for the environment. The goal is to get keys to open the doors to get to the end of the level and go through the levels until you get to the end boss of the swap zone, and to do that you have to fight the controls. I don't know if it's just the version I have or how I've set it up, but the turning is so fast, yet the walking so slow. Using the mouse improves things somewhat, but not much. I don't remember it playing like that back in the 90s, but I was young and back then I could finish the PC port of Wipeout 2097 running at twice the speed it's meant to. So maybe I just didn't notice the speed issue, or maybe, and this seems more likely, I didn't play much of this game because it's bloody awful. Attacking feels useless, like most of your weapons are just ignored. How many bars of soap do you need to throw at a big bird before it surrenders? And if you just so happen to defeat an enemy in a place you need to get through, like a gate, now you can't get through there. You can't walk through defeated enemies, so now you have to make sure to defeat them where you don't need to be. But if you do fight through and finish a level, you get to hear from this guy.
You're off to a great start, mate. I'm with you all the way, in spirit.
I always dread when there's an Australian in a video game. Why do they make us so insufferable? I haven't been this upset since Forza Horizon 4.
Crikey! How long did that take? You're not a talker, but you sure can drive. Thanks a lot, mate. See you round like a rissole.
To summarise all of that, none of the other games that are like Wolfenstein 3D are truly as good as Wolfenstein 3D, except maybe Rise of the Triad. Probably because it, despite using the same engine, is not like Wolfenstein 3D at all. Even the slightly more well-known Blake Stone games, which use the Wolf's 3D engine, Aliens of Gold and Planet Strike, I just found them frustrating to play, even if they had some interesting new features such as a silent primary weapon, informants to talk to for clues of what to do, and a map. But I still found it to just be a tedious and frustrating game to play when I actually tried to play it seriously. Shooting things didn't feel nearly as good as in Wolfenstein or Rise of the Triad. There's just a charm and a smoothness and a level of competence to Wolfenstein 3D that none of its imitators really have. So while it might not really hold up as such, you can play it now and still understand what it's doing right. The Wolfenstein Clones immediately show themselves as the pale imitators they are, which only makes me respect what ID Software did with Wolfenstein even more, except the stupid zombie enemies they introduced in episode 2. Those things can go to hell. In the 90s, ID Software pioneered fast first-person games, and were the best at making them, not just the technology, but at making the games good to play. And in 5 years, they went from pioneering their take on a raycast engine in Hovertank 3D, to Quake in 1996 with full polygons. Now, I only experienced the end of that era, but it really felt like anything was possible around that time. Game magazines regularly showed screenshots that just genuinely looked massively different than what we were used to previously, and somehow the next year after Quake 1, it felt like so much time was a child, but it was only a year. Quake 2 came out, and other developers were creating amazing things at the same time too, even just on the PC. Ken Silverman's build engine was used in Duke Nukem 3D in early 1996, which might not have the full polygons of Quake, but it had so much interactivity and such interesting environments. The most interesting environments in any first-person shooter, certainly of that era. And in 1998, we saw the first Unreal Engine in its first game, Unreal, which young me became obsessed with. If there was a Tumblr to make a fandom blog on Unreal at the time, I would have. Instead, I just uploaded terribly made maps to Planet Unreal or whatever it was. Every single one of these games felt like a massive leap. They made us all imagine a future where games would become more and more incredible. I used to love changes and advancements in new technologies, faster processors, 3D accelerators, laser mice. The next thing was better than the old thing, and that meant the next thing would be even better. But now, every time something on my computer has a patch or an update or there's a new version of something, I get angry at it because it's usually doing something new I don't want it to do, and now it's running worse than it did before and taking up more hard drive space and memory. The digital equivalent of rearranging the grocery store after I'd gotten used to it. I miss the 90s. Which is why I'm genuinely upset that we're squandering humanity's only John Carmack on that artificial general intelligence wild goose chase. What a complete waste of his talents, his genius. What we need to do is to start slipping research papers about useful things under his door. Good, important, amazing things that will help humanity and that he can become fixated on achieving. We just need to indirectly guide him to work on what humanity needs the most right now and the most important issues that humanity faces together. Making temporal anti-aliasing not look like utter crap.
Eva, auf Wiedersehen.